Whenever you come out with a book, there's already a lot of pressure on it. You have your own pressure of you're putting out a book and it's something you've worked really hard on and you want people to love it. You also just have the pressure from your friends and family. And if you have fans, you're fans of like, what will they think about it? I remember I was talking to a friend of mine years ago, and he runs a software product, and I had switched off of his software product because I needed something different. And we were talking about it, and I was like, why do you care? Like, I'm just a small customer. You've got thousands of customers. And he said, I want my friends to like what I built. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And so there's that pressure too on the book of like, I don't just want people to like it. I want people that I respect, people that I love to like my work as well. And then I've got this added pressure that we are StoryGrid and we teach people to write. My partner, Shawn Coyne, who's the creator and founder of StoryGrid, he keeps saying, this book is going to prove to everybody what StoryGrid can do for people. And I'm like, okay, let's add some more pressure on this. Not just normal, like I'm coming out with the book pressure, but we're going to prove that our company actually matters because of your book. So with all that pressure on it, I decided, well, let me just share the back end of all of this. Like, how did we go from idea to writing to editing to publishing? And so I'm doing this series on this channel walking you through all of that. So I did a previous video walking you through where I came up with the idea for the book, how it landed on me, and how I got started with the process. That's going to be linked down in the description, and so you can go watch that if you missed it. But this one's going to be talking about the theme. How did I come up with the theme of the story? Now, my name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid, and I'm the author of The Threshing, Running Down a Dream, Your First 1,000 Copies, and a couple other books, and now The Shithead, my new book coming out in September. My partner, Shawn Coyne, is the creator and founder of StoryGrid, and he has over 30 years of experience as a writer, an editor, and story researcher. And so everything that I learned about writing and we teach on this channel is based on his extensive experience and his very successful publishing career. I think everybody comes to their book in a different way. The idea for the book comes to them from different things. So you may have thought about a protagonist and this idea of the person you want to tell a story about. Or maybe you came up with the setting. If I want to tell a story in this particular setting, maybe you had a new magic system that dropped into your head. And I'm like, oh man, I have to put that in a fantasy book. So wherever you come from with your book idea, I feel like you need to come back to the beginning and think about the theme first. What we found at StoryGrid is that every decision about your story, from the characters in your story to the setting to the arc of the story, what happens in the middle, all of those decisions come all the way back to the theme. So if you don't get the theme figured out, your whole story is going to be kind of a mess. This is where when you're writing your story and you get kind of halfway through and you're like, I don't know what to do next with this story. That's where that comes from. And there's so many problems downstream of having your theme in place. So no matter where you're at in your idea for your story, so whether it's the protagonist or the setting or the magic system or whatever it is, we're going to put that on the shelf for now. We're going to come back. We're going to take it off the shelf. We're going to use it, absolutely. But for now, let's just put that on the shelf, and we're going to go back to the beginning of what we call the narrative path. So the narrative path is a step-by-step way of taking your idea for a book and turning it into an actual writable book. Now, this is different than just plotting out your book. This is different than anything else out there. I know that because before I found StoryGrid, I tried all of those other systems, and I always got this lackluster book that was really unwritable. And now, using the narrative path, this is the first time that I actually sat down and was able to write my book that became The Shithead. So the very first part of the narrative path is figuring out your theme, and there's 3 parts to it. The first part is the non-negotiable. This is the thing that you want the reader to take away from reading your book. So this is how you want the reader to change from the beginning to the end of the book. So you want your reader to change the way they see themselves, they see the world, or they see themselves in the world. This is the message of the book. Now, I often get pushback here from people of like, well, I'm not trying to write a sermon in my book, or I'm not trying to shove my ideas down people's throats when they read my book. But if your book doesn't have a point of view about the way that you see the world and how you think the world works, why are you writing it anyway? If you don't have any opinion about the characters and what they do and where they end up at the end of the story, and there's no actual like theme or message to it, you will just write a jumble of things that happen that aren't actually a story. Your non-negotiable should be worded like this. I want the reader to move from thinking X about themselves, the world, or themselves and the world, to thinking Y about themselves, the world, or themselves and the world. You're trying to get them to see something different. And this really comes down to what you believe about the world, about the things that are wrong with the world, what causes the most pain in the world, what causes the most pain for the most people in the world. And you're going to help people just see the world in a different way. This comes back to you, the writer, what you actually think about the world and how people should see it differently. So I have this belief that most of the problems in the world could be solved if people actually dealt with their internal problems first and went down deep, found who they actually are, and lived from that place. Deal with the trauma that's down there, deal with all of the hurt that's down there, because there's so much stuff down there in your soul that's causing you to do all of the destructive things in your life that if you fix that, then everything else in the world tends to just fix itself. So for a long period of my life, I was trying to be a really good father, and I was trying really hard to be a good husband and a good business person and a good friend. And I kept fucking all of that stuff up. And then once I actually dealt with my internal stuff, all the stories I was believing, all the lies I was believing about myself, once I actually dealt with that, everything in my life started getting better. I automatically became a better father, a better husband, a better friend. All of those things started automatically taking care of themselves. And so I believe that to fix the external things in the world, you have to fix the internal first. Now, you may have a different belief about the world. You may believe that the only way we can fix the problems in the world is if we all work together as a society. That's fine too. What you believe doesn't have to be what I believe, but what I believe is that, and that became my non-negotiable. I want to move the reader from believing that they're fucked up and they're broken and that they have to fix themselves to believing that they're perfect and they have everything that they need already inside of them. I know it's a little cliche, but that's what I believe. That's what changed my life. And so that's the theme of my story. That's the non-negotiable. That's where I'm going to start. When you read The Shithead, that is nowhere on the page. There is no point where I say, this is what you have to believe about yourself. That would destroy the whole story. But I know that's the message I'm trying to get to my reader, so that is my non-negotiable. Now, we're not going to get into how I do that. That's going to be a future video, and that's further down the narrative path. We're just talking about the theme. So the first step of the theme is finding your non-negotiable. What do you want the reader to change about the way they see themselves, the world, or themselves in the world from the beginning of your book to the end of the book? The next thing we've got to talk about, now that we've got our non-negotiable, is we've got to figure out our double factor problem. So this is one of the big ideas in StoryGrid that really unlocked how storytelling works and how we actually take our theme and put it into our story. So we've got the non-negotiable. I want my reader to move from feeling like they're a fucked up, broken piece of shit to understanding they're perfect and whole and have everything they need. However, there's decisions that have to be made in there. So whenever we're making decisions, we're trying to decide between two different things. So let's say that you were a kid and you've got to choose between two different toys that you can take with you on vacation. You can only take one. Your parents are only letting you take one. Now, on one hand, you have this really cool motorized robot, and it's super fun to play with, and it's one of your favorite toys. The only problem is it takes a lot of batteries, and you can only take one set of batteries with you. So you know you can play with it, and you're going to have tons of fun with it, but it may not last all the whole trip. You may get stuck with not having a toy that you can actually play with. Then on the other side is this really cool puzzle, and it's challenging and it's hard, and sometimes you get frustrated, but it's really fun to play with over a long period of time. So you enjoy the challenge, but it's not near as fun as playing with the robot. And you can only take one thing with you on this trip. This is a double factor problem. Each one is both a good and a bad choice because they both have real pros and cons. There's no clear answer. It depends on you and your trip and what you want to spend your time doing. This is a double factor problem. So when we take my non-negotiable and we look at it, well, there's a really good thing that happens when you believe you're a fucked up piece of shit and you're constantly looking around to get external validation is you get that external validation. You learn how to give people what they want so that you will get that external validation. And that creates some safety. Like everybody, you know what they want, you're giving it to them, and it creates some safety. So if all of a sudden you switch over and you start doing what you think is right and living from an internal place, that may be good for you internally, but you're probably going to piss some people off. I was telling somebody the other day, like, he's starting to make these kinds of changes in his life. I'm like, you're risking a lot here. Like, you and your wife have a certain contract that if you start acting different, that contract may break. So there's pros and cons to every decision that we make. And we need to make sure we clearly understand what the pros and cons of making that change in our non-negotiable are, and we need to write them down. So for me, when I look at making those decisions internally, that hurts really bad to constantly just like beat on myself. And switching over to actually self-acceptance is a really good thing internally, right? So we have the pro, which is I get myself back and I actually live from an authentic place, and con is I keep doing what other people think and kind of beating myself up internally. But again, switch to the external. Well, if I make that switch to self-acceptance, I'm going to lose something external. I'm going to lose relationships. I may lose my job. I may lose some things. And I also may gain some things. Maybe eventually I'll find something that I love, but I don't know that that's actually going to happen. So whenever we're thinking through that change that we want the reader to go through, which is the change we want our protagonist to go through, we're going to talk about that next. We have to think about what they're risking both internally and externally and be really honest about it. And we have to think of scenarios where people shouldn't make that switch. So I live in the Western world, I live in the United States, and there's lots of freedoms here, and there's lots of different types of culture within this one culture. So if I make a big internal shift that kind of wrecks my external world, I can probably find my way back to something that is actually livable, that is safe, where I have friends and family again, but I am going to risk that in the short term. But let's say I lived in a different culture where if I started living out of my self-acceptance and I completely wrecked my external world, I would die. Like, one is I might actually be killed. The other is I might get ostracized and kicked out of my culture, and there is no other culture for me, and I would die. And so there are scenarios where just because I think this is a good thing for most people to make this switch, there's scenarios where people shouldn't actually make this switch. They should still live according to external things because otherwise they will physically die. And if you can't be honest with yourself about that kind of pros and cons situation, you're never going to actually write a full three-dimensional story. And this was a really hard switch for me, actually having to sit down and think through, like, yes, I believe this, and yet there has to be times where this isn't the right answer for people. So this is where you come up with your double factor problem. Is, okay, we have where our reader is going to be at the beginning of the story, where they are at the end, what are they getting pros and cons internally, and then what are they getting pros and cons externally. And now I have a full, actual, true, three-dimensional view of this change that I want people to make. And it's going to play out in the book in a really big way, because this is the stuff that starts helping you understand the context of your story, the characters of your story, and so on. But we're going to move on. So that is the non-negotiable. That is the double factor problem. Now let's look at where you actually write out the controlling idea of your story. Okay, the controlling idea is the one sentence that encapsulates the entire theme of your story. So that takes the non-negotiable and the double factor problem and it puts it into one sentence. And this is going to be the theme that we come back to over and over as we figure out the rest of the narrative path. So when we're talking about my book, The Shithead, the non-negotiable is moving the reader from feeling like they are broken and worthless to self-acceptance and understanding they are perfect. And the double factor problem is all about being real about that tension between dealing with external validation and internal self-acceptance. And so when we look at the controlling idea of this story, you can sum it up like this. True self-acceptance and inner peace are achieved not through conforming to societal expectations, but by embracing one's authentic self, even at the risk of external rejection. So this is going to be the sentence I come back to over and over and over. We're going to be looking at these three pieces as I figure out who the characters of my story is, as I figure out what the setting of my story is going to be, when I think about the different genres I can tell my story in, the arcs of my characters. It's all going to come back to this theme. Now, again, this is not what I want you to hear. We are not writing a sermon. That is not what your book is going to be. There's not going to be any part of my book, The Shithead, that explicitly says this on the page. This is just going to inform the decisions that I'm going to make for my story. It creates a bound around my story so I know why the story exists and what I'm trying to say with all of these characters and things that happen in the story. This is so important to have at the beginning. If you don't start with your theme, you're going to come up with all kinds of random things that happen in your book that aren't on theme. And this is where people say they've got to write 300,000 words before they can find their book. And it's like, sure, that's one way to do it. Just like, I live in Nashville and I can get to Chicago if I walk, but there's things like cars and airplanes that are easier to get there as well. And so by actually thinking through your theme first, it saves you from basically thrashing around for months or years trying to find what you're actually trying to say. And then if you start there, you can actually craft a story that has a through line through the entire thing and helps you figure out what your story is going to be about. So this is how you develop your theme for your story. You've got to figure out what your non-negotiable is, that thing that you want the reader to change the way they see themselves, the world, or themselves in the world from the beginning to the end of your book. You develop the double factor problem, so you have the true and honest pros and cons of making that change, both internally and externally. And then you sum all of that up in one sentence that it encapsulates the change that your protagonist and your reader is going to make from the beginning to the end of your story. So that's the theme of your story. Now, if you want to dig deeper into this idea of theme, I have a great video for you. It's going to pop up on your screen shortly, or you can click it down in the description right now if you want to keep learning about theme. The next thing we're going to cover as we continue to talk about how I wrote and edited and published The Shithead is genre, and we're going to look at the 5-leaf genre clover. So that's going to come up next. If you want to find out more about StoryGrid, make sure you go to storygrid.com, check out all of the free resources, and make sure you sign up for the newsletter. That's where we send out all the latest and greatest stuff. Also, if you want to pre-order a copy of my book, The Shithead, you can do that at Amazon or at storygrid.com. But as always, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.